All right, I want you to imagine something for a second. Picture your city, your neighborhood. Now imagine that within a year, 1 in every 4 people you know will be gone, dead. No, this isn't some Hollywood movie plot. This was the terrifying reality for Londoners back in 1665. We're about to dive deep into the Great Plague, a catastrophe that literally brought a city to its knees and, well, the unbelievable event that finally put an end to it. 100,000. Just let that number sink in for a moment. That's the estimated death toll in just over a single year. But, a number like that, as huge as it is, doesn't really tell the whole story, does it? To really get the sheer horror of it, we've got to understand what that meant for every single person living in London back then. And this is what that number actually looks like. The plague wiped out a full 25% of London's entire population. Seriously, just think about that. 1 in every 4 people. Your friends, your neighbors, your family, gone. The city was, for all intents and purposes, living through a real-life apocalypse. So how in the world did London become such a death trap? Well, the truth is, the seeds of this disaster were planted long, long before the first person even got sick. You see, 17th century London, it was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And the plague was the match. So let's meet the microscopic killer at the heart of all this, Yersinia pestis. This little bacterium was the assassin, right? But it couldn't do the job alone. It needed accomplices. It hitched a ride on fleas, and those fleas, in turn, used an entire army of black rats as their getaway cars, just swarming through every single street and every home in London. And this is where things get really interesting, because you have to understand this crucial distinction. You've got the biological cause over here, the bacteria, the rats, the fleas. That was the spark for sure. But the real problem, the fuel for the fire, was London itself. We're talking about overcrowded, narrow, filthy streets, cramped, dirty houses. It was literally the perfect environment for a biological firestorm to just explode. And so the spark finally arrives. It all started quietly, almost without anyone noticing, in the spring of 1665. It most likely came in on ships from the Netherlands. And while the city officials were trying to keep it all hush-hush, to stop a panic, the invisible enemy was already spreading. It started in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, and the clock was officially ticking. Okay, so as the weather got warmer, that ticking time bomb we talked about, it finally went off. The small spring outbreak completely mushroomed into a summer-long nightmare. The city just descended into absolute chaos and fear. I mean, just look at how fast this thing escalated. It's unbelievable. What started as just a few isolated cases in the spring became a completely uncontrollable inferno by summer. And then, by September, at its peak, the city was losing over 7,000 people in a single week. Can you even imagine that? It's just an unimaginable rate of death. And the way people died, it was horrific. Death usually came within just a few days. Victims would suffer from these raging fevers, these incredibly painful swellings called buboes, usually in the armpit or groin. And then came the dark blotches on the skin, which is actually where the infamous name, the Black Death, comes from. Can you even imagine seeing this painted on your neighbor's door? Lord have mercy upon us. It was both a desperate prayer and a grim, grim death sentence. A red cross was painted on the door, and the entire family, everyone inside, was sealed in for 40 days. They were often just left to die in there together. So, what did the city do to fight back? Well, this is where the crisis really starts to reveal some deep, deep cracks in society. The official response was, well, it was a mix of pure desperation and a profound lack of understanding, and the whole social fabric just started to tear apart. You have to remember, they were facing a total nightmare, so the city's leaders just responded with whatever desperate measures they could think of. They boarded up sick people in their own homes, carts would come around at night collecting the dead, and in a really tragic, fatal mistake, they ordered a mass killing of cats and dogs because they wrongly blamed them for spreading the disease. Of course, all that did was clear the way for the real culprits, the rats, to multiply like crazy. And yeah, the plague definitely did not treat everyone equally. Your chance of survival pretty much came down to one thing: how much money you had. King Charles II and his entire court, they fled to Oxford. All the rich folks and aristocrats, they escaped to their big houses in the countryside. But the poor? For them, there was no escape. They were just trapped, abandoned in a dying city. And then you have these guys, the plague doctors. You've probably seen the iconic masks. While they were trying to help, their methods were, well, pretty ineffective. They really symbolized just how primitive medical understanding was at the time. Those famous beak-like masks, they were stuffed with herbs and spices because they thought it would protect them from the bad air, or miasma, which they believed was causing the disease. Eventually, though, the plague's fever started to break. But the way it ended, nobody could have seen it coming. It was a dramatic, completely unexpected twist. Just as London was finally starting to catch its breath, a second, totally different disaster was about to hit. So, nature actually provided the first bit of real relief. The number of new cases finally started to drop. The winter of 1666 was really harsh, and that cold weather helped kill off a lot of the fleas and rats, which, finally started to slow that chain of transmission down. So the city was battered and bruised, but it was finally starting to heal. But history wasn't quite done with London, not by a long shot. In September of 1666, a small fire started in a baker's shop on a street called Pudding Lane. And that little spark ignited a whole new kind of terror, an inferno that would just consume the city. And here's the thing. In a stroke of what you can only call cruel irony, the Great Fire of London may have been the very thing that saved the city from the plague for good. It burned down and destroyed so much of that old, filthy, cramped medieval part of London, which basically sterilized the city and wiped out the rats' breeding grounds. One disaster kinda cured another. Now, the Great Plague obviously left deep, deep scars on London. But its legacy, well, it also planted the seeds of the modern city we know today. The sheer devastation forced a kind of reckoning that would end up changing London forever.
I mean, a disaster of this scale, it forced a painful but absolutely necessary evolution. It changed how cities were managed, how public health was even understood. It really exposed the deadly, deadly consequences of bad sanitation and laid the groundwork for things like urban planning and public health reforms.
And the plague's impact echoed through culture, too. It led to much more systematic record-keeping, things like the bills of mortality, which were basically weekly statistics on who was dying and from what. It was also immortalized in literature, like Daniel Defoe's book. All of this marks this huge cultural shift away from pure superstition and towards a more modern way of thinking about disease. So when you look at the whole picture, it was just a brutal but truly transformational moment in history. A devastating human tragedy, absolutely. But out of the ashes, literally the ashes of both the plague and the fire, a new, stronger, more resilient London was born. And it kind of makes you think, right? How do the echoes of what happened back then, the lessons that were learned in the hardest way imaginable, how do they shape our own responses to crises today? It's a question that makes this story, which happened over 350 years ago, feel more relevant than ever.